Jacob Miller had never been the type to seek attention, but on that day, attention was forced upon him, cruelly and without mercy. It was just another ordinary morning at Westfield High, where the hum of students' chatter filled the air like a dull, lifeless buzz. But for Jacob, it was anything but ordinary. His boots, still carrying the scent of fresh soil from his early morning chores, clacked against the polished floors as he made his way to his seat. He was different from the others. No one knew it better than him. The students at Westfield came from families of doctors, lawyers, and business owners, people who wore suits and held positions of power. Jacob, however, was the grandson of a farmer. His rough hands bore the marks of years spent toiling in the fields. His mind wasn't always focused on books. It was often lost in thoughts of cattle, crops, and harvests. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. But the truth was, Jacob didn't belong at Westfield High, not in the eyes of most people there. It wasn't the first time he'd felt out of place, but today the sting of being different was sharper than ever. Miss Whitmore, his history teacher, had always been particularly dismissive of him. She was a woman who carried herself with an air of superiority, her sharp eyes constantly scanning the classroom for signs of weakness, ready to pounce on anything that didn't meet her high standards. She made it clear from day one that the students in her class were expected to be the best, and Jacob knew he was far from her idea of excellence. That morning, the class was discussing the Civil War, a topic that seemed irrelevant to Jacob's everyday life. While the others appeared to be following along with ease, Jacob's mind was far away. His body was here, sitting at the desk, but his thoughts were with the chickens that needed feeding and the fields waiting to be ploughed. Miss Whitmore caught his distraction. Her voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Mr. Miller," she snapped, her cold gaze locked onto him. "Can you tell the class about the Civil War?" Jacob froze. His mind went blank, the words tangled in his throat. He had no idea what the class was talking about. Miss Whitmore's sharp, disapproving stare only made things worse. She sighed dramatically, crossing her arms in disdain. The silence stretched on, heavy with the weight of everyone's eyes on him. The class was waiting for him to speak, but the more he tried to focus, the more distant everything felt. "Mr. Miller," she said again, her tone growing colder. "Maybe, if you spent more time on your studies and less time out there in the fields, you wouldn't be so unprepared." The class snickered. Jacob felt his face flush with shame, but that wasn't the worst of it. Her next words hit him like a slap across the face. "Maybe you should stick to what you know best, feeding pigs and ploughing dirt." The laughter that followed was cruel, echoing in Jacob's ears. Every single student in that room, his classmates, the ones who saw themselves as destined for greatness, were now looking at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. Jacob wanted to shrink into himself, to vanish right there on the spot, but he didn't. Not this time. His fingers tightened around the edge of the desk, knuckles turning white as he fought the storm of emotions threatening to break through. He didn't say a word, though. His voice was lost, swallowed by the humiliation that weighed on him like 1,000 pounds. The tension in the air was thick, everyone waiting for him to crumble, to accept the role they had cast him in. But Jacob didn't. He stood up, his legs shaking slightly, but still strong. "I may not be as book-smart as the rest," he said, his voice steady, though every word felt like it took everything in him to say. "But that doesn't mean I don't deserve respect." The room fell silent. The snickers died out, replaced by a stunned stillness that hung over everyone like a cloud. Jacob didn't wait for a response. Without another word, he grabbed his books, his hands still trembling slightly, and walked out of the classroom. The door clicked shut behind him, and for the first time that day, he felt his heart pounding with something other than shame, something more like defiance. Jacob Miller didn't belong at Westfield High. That was the cold truth he carried with him every single day. The hallways, lined with glossy lockers and buzzing with the chatter of privileged students, felt more like a maze than a school too. Every morning, as he trudged through the front doors, he could feel the eyes of his classmates following him, their judgment heavy and palpable. To them, he was just another kid from the country, different, out of place, and somehow inferior. To the polished, well-dressed students who surrounded him, he was the grandson of a farmer, a boy whose hands were rough from the hours spent in the fields, whose clothes often smelled faintly of soil and sweat, and whose life had always been dictated by the rise and fall of crops rather than the score of a test. Jacob wasn't dumb, far from it. But his life didn't follow the same script as the others. His mornings began long before the sun even considered rising. He'd wake up at 4 a.m., before even the roosters were awake, to tend to the farm. The chickens needed feeding, the cows needed milking, and the fields needed tending. By the time he got to school, his body ached from the hard labor. His mind clouded with exhaustion, but it was all he knew. It was the rhythm of his life: work, struggle, survive. But Westfield High didn't care about that. The students at Westfield were from families that had doctors, lawyers, and business tycoons as their ancestors. Their parents had corner offices, new cars, and lives that seemed so foreign to Jacob that sometimes he wasn't sure how to talk to them. They had no idea what it was like to wake up at 4 a.m. to work in the fields before school, or to spend every holiday helping on the farm instead of going to the beach. Their lives were smooth, like the shine of their polished shoes, while his was rough like the calluses on his hands. As Jacob walked through the crowded hallways, he could hear the whispers behind his back. "He's just a farmer's kid," they'd say. "Probably doesn't even know how to use a computer." The laughs that followed stung like tiny needles. They didn't know him. They didn't know the sacrifices he'd made, the responsibility he'd carried since he was old enough to hold a rake. To them, he was nothing more than a stereotype, just a kid from a farm. And the worst part, it wasn't just the students, it was the teachers too. His history class with Ms. Whitmore had become the worst part of his day. She was everything Jacob hated about the system. A woman whose academic credentials were as polished as her perfectly pressed suits. She was sharp, exact, and she never let anyone forget how much better she thought she was. The thing about Ms. Whitmore was that she was ruthless. She never showed mercy, especially not to Jacob. On most days, Jacob kept his head down. He did his best to keep up, but the constant exhaustion from his early mornings made it hard to focus. Sometimes his eyes would wander out the window, watching the trees sway in the wind. He wasn't interested in the Civil War or the Greek philosophers. His mind was always elsewhere, always thinking about the farm, about the tasks he had to finish once school ended. But he didn't dare show it. He didn't want to give anyone more reasons to mock him. That day, however, everything changed. Ms. Whitmore had been going over the Civil War, her voice droning on about the battles, the strategies, the political implications. Jacob's eyes were barely open. His head drooped against his hand, his thoughts drifting to the cows that would need milking in just a few hours. He barely heard Ms. Whitmore's sharp voice calling on him. "Mr. Miller," she said, her tone so cold it felt like ice. "Tell the class about the significance of the Battle of Gettysburg." Jacob snapped to attention. He had no idea. He had barely studied for the quiz, let alone for the lesson. His mouth went dry as he searched for something to say, anything that would make him sound like he knew what she was talking about. The class watched, some with curious expressions, others with a hint of amusement in their eyes. Jacob could feel the pressure mounting, the sweat beading on his forehead. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. "Mr. Miller," Ms. Whitmore repeated, her eyes narrowing. "I'm waiting." The room was silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall, the seconds stretching out, suffocating him. "Mr. Miller," she repeated once more, louder this time. "Maybe if you spent less time out in the fields, you'd actually learn something useful." The words cut deep. Jacob's face flushed, his heart racing in his chest. He tried to say something, anything, but all that came out was a nervous stammer. The class started laughing, not just a few chuckles, but full-on, mocking laughter. Jacob's chest tightened, and he looked down at his desk, wishing he could just disappear. He wanted to cry. He wanted to scream at them, to make them understand how hard he worked, how much his family sacrificed, but he didn't. Instead, he sat there, humiliated, as Ms. Whitmore continued her tirade. "Perhaps it's time you focused on something you're actually good at, like feeding pigs and plowing dirt," she sneered, her voice dripping with disdain. The room erupted into more laughter, and Jacob could feel every inch of his self-worth crumbling. His classmates, the same ones who had once looked at him with indifference, now saw him as a joke. They saw him as nothing more than a farm boy, and that's all he would ever be. The weight of the humiliation crashed down on him, but there was nothing he could do. He couldn't argue with her, couldn't make her see. The moment felt endless. Finally, Jacob stood up. His hands were shaking, but his face was a mask of cold determination. "I may not be as book-smart as the rest of you," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "But that doesn't mean I deserve to be treated like this." For a moment the class fell silent. The laughter stopped, and all eyes were on him. Jacob didn't care. He didn't care if they laughed or if they mocked him. He was done. He grabbed his books and walked out of the classroom, his heart pounding, his mind spinning with a mixture of anger and defeat. The door slammed behind him, and he stood there in the hallway, his chest heaving. He had never felt so alone. In that moment, he realized something he hadn't before. The people at this school, his classmates, his teachers, none of them understood him. None of them saw the person he was. They saw a stereotype. They saw the farmer's kid who didn't belong, and Jacob wasn't sure he could take it anymore. Jacob Miller had always been the quiet one in school, keeping his head low, staying out of the spotlight. But that day, in Ms. Whitmore's history class, he couldn't escape the spotlight no matter how hard he tried. It had been brewing for weeks. The tension between him and the students who came from money, from wealth, from families who didn't know what it meant to wake up at dawn, covered in the scent of freshly tilled soil. Jacob was different, his hands calloused from working. The farm, his clothes often carrying the lingering smell of cattle and crops. He didn't mind the hard work. It was all he had ever known. But here, at Westfield High, it was a curse. Jacob was used to the whispers. "He's just a farmer's kid," they'd say as he passed by. "He probably doesn't even know what a smartphone is." The mockery was subtle, but it always cut deeper than anyone could imagine. It wasn't just the students, it was the teachers too. Ms. Whitmore, his history teacher, was perhaps the most ruthless of them all. She had an air of superiority, a harsh, calculating gaze that made even the most confident students shrink under her scrutiny. To her, Jacob was just another problem. A kid who didn't belong in her classroom. A kid who didn't meet her standards. She didn't have time for people like him. People who came from nothing, who worked the land, who weren't worthy of the same opportunities as the rest of the class. Jacob tried his best to blend in, to keep his head down and his mouth shut. But it was impossible. Every day, Miss Whitmore's condescending comments about his work ethic, his background, and his family felt like a sharp blade slicing through his self-esteem. And today was different. Today, everything would boil over. The lesson that day was on the Civil War. Miss Whitmore was speaking passionately about the battles, the strategies, the implications. But Jacob couldn't focus. His mind kept drifting to the chores he still had to finish. Animals to feed, fences to mend, fields to tend. His hands ached just thinking about it. He had barely slept the night before, working late into the evening, just like he always did. But none of that mattered to Miss Whitmore. To her, his exhaustion was just a weakness, a flaw. When she called on him, Jacob's heart sank. His eyes darted around the room, but everyone seemed to be watching him, waiting for him to fail. Yow. Pressure was suffocating. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His mind was blank, clouded by the stress, the fatigue, the humiliation he'd been carrying for weeks. It felt like the whole room was holding its breath, waiting for him to make a mistake. Mr. Miller, Ms. Whitmore's voice sliced through the silence. Can you tell us what caused the Battle of Gettysburg to be so pivotal? Jacob's chest tightened. He had no idea. He could feel the eyes of the class on him, the weight of their judgment pressing down on him like 1,000 pounds. It wasn't just about the battle. It was about proving that he could be more than just the kid from the farm. But how could he explain something he barely understood himself? He opened his mouth again, but his throat was dry. He tried to recall something, anything that might sound intelligent, but all he could think about were the cows that needed milking, the crops that needed harvesting. His thoughts felt like a tangled mess, and he couldn't find his way out. Miss Whitmore raised an eyebrow. Mr. Miller, it's not that difficult. Are you really telling me you can't remember a simple fact about the Civil War? The class was dead silent now. Every eye in the room was locked on him, and Jacob felt the heat of their stares like fire. He swallowed hard, struggling to come up with something, anything, but it was too late. Miss Whitmore, her voice dripping with disdain, spoke again. Mr. Miller, she said, her words sharp and cutting, maybe you should stick to what you know best, feeding pigs and ploughing dirt. The words hit him like a slap to the face. The entire class erupted in laughter. Jacob's face burned with shame as the laughter echoed in his ears. The ridicule, the mockery, it was all too much. His hands shook, his stomach churned. He wanted to scream, to run out of the room, but he couldn't. He was frozen, trapped in the moment. It wasn't the first time someone had insulted him because of his background. He'd heard it before, from classmates and teachers alike. But hearing it from Ms. Whitmore, the one person who was supposed to be a role model, the one person who was supposed to educate him, lift him up, stung in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't just the insult, it was the judgment, the complete dismissal of his worth as a person. In her eyes, he was nothing more than a country bumpkin, someone too ignorant to be worthy of respect. The laughter continued, but Jacob didn't hear it anymore. The world around him faded to a blur as a rush of anger and humiliation flooded through him. He wanted to fight back, to shout at them all, to make them understand that he wasn't some joke, but he couldn't. All he could do was sit there, feeling smaller and smaller with every passing second. Ms. Whitmore's eyes flicked over him, her lips curling into a smile. She had won. She had humiliated him in front of the entire class, and she was proud of it. She didn't even look at him as she turned away, continuing her lecture as if nothing had happened, as if Jacob were nothing more than a shadow, a passing inconvenience. But Jacob wasn't invisible. No, in that moment, he knew he wasn't invisible at all. He was something worse, nothing more than a punching bag for their ridicule. And, as the class continued, the words of Miss Whitmore rang in his ears. Stick to what you know best. The tears burned behind his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He wasn't weak. He wasn't going to let her win. He wasn't going to let her make him believe that he was worth less than anyone else. Not this time. Jacob stood up, his hands gripping the edge of his desk with a strength he didn't know he had. The room fell silent as he walked out of the classroom, the eyes of his classmates following him. No one said a word, but Jacob knew what they were thinking. They saw him as weak, as nothing more than the kid who didn't belong. But as he walked out of the room, he made a promise to himself. He would show them all. He would prove them wrong, not by conforming to their expectations, but by doing something they would never expect. He wasn't a farm boy. He wasn't a failure. And he wasn't going to let anyone, especially Ms. Whitmore, make him feel worthless ever again. Jacob Miller had never been the type to stir up trouble. He was quiet, reserved, and carried a burden most of his classmates would never understand. He was the kid from the farm, the one who didn't belong in a school full of students whose families were doctors, lawyers, or business owners. To them, Jacob was a joke, a stereotype they couldn't escape. And Jacob hated it. He hated the way they looked at him, the way they spoke behind his back, and most of all, he hated the way his teacher, Miss Whitmore, made him feel small. It had been building up for weeks. The taunts, the insults, the condescending glances, but that day it hit a new level. It was supposed to be a normal history class. The lesson was about the Civil War, a subject that meant nothing to Jacob. He had his own battles to fight, on the farm, with his family, just to make it through each day. He was exhausted from the long hours he worked before school, and the night before had been no different. Jacob had fed the livestock, repaired the broken fence, and still managed to get a few hours of sleep before heading to school. But none of that mattered to Miss Whitmore. To her, Jacob was just another distraction, another lazy kid who couldn't keep up. As the class went on, Miss Whitmore started asking questions. One by one the students answered, their responses sharp and confident. But when it was Jacob's turn, he froze. His mind was a blur, the words scrambled. He had no idea what they were talking about. He couldn't focus on anything beyond the farm. "Mr. Miller," Miss Whitmore called, her voice sharp as a blade, "care to enlighten us on the significance of the Battle of Gettysburg?" Jacob's stomach twisted. He didn't know the answer. He never had time to study the way the other kids did. His mornings were spent working, his evenings the same. But that was something no one understood. No one except his grandfather, who had raised him to believe that hard work and perseverance mattered more than any classroom lesson. But Miss Whitmore didn't care. She had already made up her mind about him. She wasn't going to let him off the hook. Not now, not ever. "I said," Miss Whitmore repeated, her voice growing louder. "Mr. Miller, why don't you tell us what made the Battle of Gettysburg so pivotal?" Jacob's face flushed with embarrassment. The whole class was watching him, waiting for him to fail. He could feel their eyes on him, the judgment hanging in the air. Every second felt like an eternity. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Then the worst thing happened. Miss Whitmore let out a sigh, loud enough for the whole class to hear. "You know, Mr. Miller, if you spent more time studying instead of out there in the fields, maybe you'd know the answer to simple questions like this." The class burst into laughter. Jacob felt like he had been punched in the stomach. It wasn't just the words. It was the way she said them, like he was less than them, less than anyone in that room. The laughter echoed in his ears, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. The humiliation was too much. His face burned, his hands clenched into fists, but he stayed silent. Miss Whitmore wasn't done yet. "Maybe you should stick to what you know best, feeding pigs and plowing dirt," she said, sneering at him like he was some sort of joke. The room erupted into more laughter. Jacob could barely hear over the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He wanted to scream, to shout at them all, to make them understand how hard he worked, how much he sacrificed just to get through each day. But he didn't. Instead, he felt something rise within him, a storm he hadn't seen coming. His heart was racing, his body shaking with anger, but something else was there too, something stronger than the humiliation. It was defiance. Jacob stood up, his legs unsteady, but his resolve firm. The room fell silent. His classmates had stopped laughing, their eyes now on him. Miss Whitmore raised an eyebrow, surprised by his sudden movement. "I may not be as book-smart as the rest," Jacob said, his voice quiet but steady, "but that doesn't mean I don't deserve respect." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The class was still, every eye fixed on him. For the first time since he'd stepped foot in Westfield High, Jacob didn't feel small. He didn't feel inferior. He felt like he had finally taken control of something. The pain of the past weeks, the mockery, the cruelty, it all came pouring out in that single sentence. "I don't need to be like you," Jacob continued, his voice growing stronger, "and I don't need your approval, but I will not stand here and be treated like dirt." The silence in the room deepened. Even Miss Whitmore, who had always looked at him with disdain, was taken aback. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jacob could feel the weight of every person's gaze, but he didn't look away. He didn't back down. Then, without another word, Jacob grabbed his books, his hands still shaking, but now with a newfound strength. He walked toward the door, every step filled with a sense of purpose. As he reached the threshold, he turned around for one last look at the class. "Respect isn't something you give based on wealth or status," he said, his voice quiet but unwavering. "It's earned through hard work and integrity, and I've earned mine." With that, Jacob walked out of the classroom, his heart pounding, his mind racing. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he had just done something powerful. Outside the classroom, Jacob didn't know what would happen next. Would his classmates start to see him differently? Would they respect him now, or would they just forget him the moment he left the room? It didn't matter. What mattered was that he had stood up for himself. He had fought back against the weight of their expectations, their mockery, and their judgment. As Jacob made his way down the hallway, he felt something change within him. It wasn't the kind of change that came from anyone else's approval. It wasn't about getting validation from people who didn't understand him. It was the kind of change that came from within, a quiet, powerful resolve that would carry him through the rest of his life. He wasn't just a farm boy. He wasn't a failure. He was Jacob Miller. And from now on, he would define who he was, no one else. As he walked away from Westfield High, he knew he had just made the first step towards something bigger, something more important, something no one could take away from him, his self-respect, and that more than anything was worth fighting for. The next morning was like any other at Westfield High, at least for the students. The sun was rising slowly, casting its golden light over the campus, the usual hum of teenage chatter filling the halls. But for Jacob Miller, nothing felt normal. He had left the classroom yesterday, humiliated, broken in front of his classmates. Miss Whitmore's cruel words were still echoing in his mind. "Maybe you should stick to what you know best. Feeding pigs and ploughing dirt." The laughter, the scorn. It had all been too much. He didn't even care about the lesson. He didn't care about history or the Civil War. What mattered now was proving everyone wrong, proving Miss Whitmore wrong, proving to himself that he wasn't just the farm boy they all thought he was. As Jacob walked through the school halls that morning, he couldn't escape the whispers. The students who had once mocked him now looked at him with a different kind of gaze. Was it pity? Curiosity? It didn't matter. Jacob kept his head down, ignoring them as best as he could. He didn't need their approval anymore, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. He could feel it in his gut. It was the kind of feeling that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Something big was coming. It wasn't long before the students started to notice it too. The distant sound of a helicopter, its blades chopping through the morning air. At first it was faint, a low hum, almost like a dream, but then it grew louder, cutting through the routine of their day, growing louder with every passing second. "Is that a helicopter?" one student asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of curiosity and fear. The others froze, looking toward the sky. The sound was deafening now, growing louder and louder, and then, suddenly, there it was, a sleek black helicopter cutting through the morning air like a knife. Its rotors whipped the wind, causing the leaves on the trees to dance and swirl. The students, now standing in clusters, watched in disbelief as the helicopter descended onto the school's football field. It was massive, almost out of place against the backdrop of the ordinary high school campus. "Who's that?" someone whispered, their voice barely audible over the sound of the helicopter's engines. The students squinted, trying to make out who could possibly be arriving in such an extravagant fashion. No one in the school had ever seen anything like this before, but Jacob, still trying to ignore the attention he was getting, couldn't help but notice the way the teachers were moving too. They were running toward the field. His curiosity piqued. He found himself walking toward the doors leading outside. What was going on? Who was arriving in a helicopter at Westfield High? It was a mystery, a spectacle that had no place in their usual school day. As Jacob stepped outside, the sight of the helicopter landing in front of the football field left him momentarily stunned. The engines were still roaring, the machine hovering, slightly above the ground as it came to a stop. The wind whipped through the air, sending dust swirling across the field. But it wasn't the helicopter itself that caught Jacob's attention. It was the man stepping out of it. He was tall, dressed in an immaculate suit, his presence commanding the field in a way that seemed almost surreal. The moment he stepped out of the helicopter, every eye on the field was drawn to him. Even the teachers, who had been standing in stunned silence, now seemed to instinctively step back, as if they recognized him immediately. Jacob didn't know why, but the man looked vaguely familiar. There was something about him that felt significant, something about his presence that sent a chill down Jacob's spine. The man moved with an air of power, of authority, like he was used to being in control. His every step was purposeful, deliberate, as though the world itself made way for him. "Who is that?" Jacob muttered under his breath, still standing at the edge of the field, unable to look away. But then it hit him. The man wasn't just someone important. He was someone he knew. That was when it clicked. The man in the suit wasn't just any businessman. He wasn't some random figure of wealth or power. No, this man, this stranger, was none other than his grandfather, James Miller. James Miller, the man who had built an empire. The man who had turned a small farm into a multi-million-dollar agribusiness, revolutionizing sustainable farming across the country. The man who was a name known in boardrooms and across the nation. The man who had sponsored projects at Westfield High. The man who, unbeknownst to most, had a deep, unwavering affection for his grandson, Jacob Miller. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. Why was he here? And why today of all days? As his grandfather made his way across the field, Jacob felt a mixture of dread and curiosity wash over him. The teachers were still standing frozen, their faces pale. Some of the students were starting to murmur, the whispers growing louder by the second. Jacob could feel their eyes on him now, as if they were beginning to understand who he really was. Miss Whitmore, of course, was the first to make a move. She walked toward Jacob's grandfather with an expression of confusion, maybe even fear. Jacob stood back, watching the scene unfold as his grandfather's voice rang out. "Mr. Miller, I understand there's been an issue with my grandson." "In your class," James Miller said, his deep voice carrying across the field. His tone was calm, measured, but it held a weight that demanded respect. Miss Whitmore's face turned a shade paler. She stammered, fumbling for the right words. "Mr. Miller, I assure you, I treat all of my students equally." James Miller, undeterred by her nervousness, continued. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice growing colder. "You see, I built this school's science lab. I funded the history program you oversee, and yet you had the audacity to humiliate my grandson because of his background." The words struck like a thunderclap, and Jacob could feel the tension building in the air, thick with the weight of his grandfather's authority. Miss Whitmore faltered, looking around nervously as the students began to whisper among themselves. "I raised Jacob to understand that hard work is honorable, James Miller said, his gaze narrowing, his tone unwavering. Perhaps you should educate yourself on that instead of looking down on those who put food on your table. Jacob stood motionless, watching as his grandfather's words pierced through the cold air. He had always known his grandfather was powerful, but to see him in action like this, standing up for him, felt like a surreal moment, like the entire world had shifted in his favor. "I don't need special treatment," Jacob said, stepping forward into the silence that had overtaken the field. His voice was steady, his posture taller than it had ever been. "I just want to be treated with respect, the same as everyone else." Miss Whitmore, unable to meet his gaze, nodded stiffly. "I understand," she muttered, her voice barely audible. The students, once too scared to look up from their phones or books, were now watching in awe. Some even whispered among themselves in admiration, nodding toward Jacob. He wasn't just the farm kid anymore. He wasn't the one who would let himself be bullied. He was someone with dignity, someone who commanded respect. James Miller turned to his grandson, his face breaking into a proud smile. "Respect isn't something you get because of wealth or status, Jacob. It's something you earn." The tension on the field had broken. The students, once cold and judgmental, now saw Jacob for who he truly was, not just a farmer's son, but a young man of integrity, of strength. And Miss Whitmore, for all her power, had learned a valuable lesson. You can never underestimate someone based on their background. James Miller turned to leave, his presence still commanding attention as he walked back toward the helicopter. Jacob stood there, watching the man who had just changed everything for him. As the helicopter lifted off, the final words his grandfather had spoken echoed in Jacob's mind. "You earn respect, and you've earned it today." It's the morning after Jacob Miller was humiliated in front of the entire class. You'd think the school day would be just another ordinary routine, right? But then the ground shakes, the air goes still, and something big, something impossible, happens. A helicopter, sleek and black, lands in the middle of the football field, and as the dust settles, a tall figure steps out, Jacob's grandfather. But this isn't just any old man. This is James Miller, one of the wealthiest, most powerful businessmen in the country, and the man who owns this school. The students are frozen. No one moves. The air is thick with confusion, curiosity, and fear. The ground beneath them feels unstable, as if something is about to shift, the kind of shift that can turn everything upside down. They watch in disbelief as Jacob's grandfather, James Miller, strides onto the school grounds. His posture is commanding, his steps purposeful, like he owns the very earth beneath his feet. And for all intents and purposes, he does. But none of them realize the true reason he's here. Jacob. For weeks, Jacob Miller had been the subject of ridicule, mocked by classmates and belittled by his history teacher, Miss Whitmore. She was the embodiment of everything Jacob hated, elitist, smug, and determined to make him feel small. "Maybe you should stick to what you know best, feeding pigs and plowing dirt." Those were her words that day. But what she didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that Jacob's family wasn't just some humble farm operation. They were the Miller family, a name that meant power, influence, and money. Money that funded this school, her program. And now Jacob's grandfather was here to confront her. The crowd of students on the football field stands still, their eyes wide as the helicopter blades stop spinning and the dust settles. The teachers, once so assured, so confident, are now whispering amongst themselves, unsure of what to do, unsure of what is happening. And then James Miller approaches the school doors. Miss Whitmore, looking smug as always, is the first to step forward. She's taken aback by the man's presence, clearly not expecting the visitor, but it doesn't faze her. After all, she's the teacher, the one in control, the one who calls the shots, or so she thinks. Jacob stands behind him, his face unreadable. The tension in the air thickens as his grandfather opens his mouth. Ms. Whitmore, James Miller's deep voice cuts through the thick silence. It's not loud, no, it's steady, measured, the kind of voice that commands respect with every word. His eyes lock onto Miss Whitmore, his gaze unflinching. "I understand there's been an issue with my grandson in your class." Her eyes widen, her confident demeanor starting to crack. She had been ready for any confrontation except this one. Mr. Miller, she stammers, caught off guard, struggling to regain her composure. "I assure you, I treat all my students equally." James Miller's gaze sharpens, and the room goes silent. Even the students, once full of whispers and murmurs, now hold their breath. Is that so? His words are like a slap to the face, but they're wrapped in calm authority. He steps closer, his presence undeniable. "You see, Ms. Whitmore, this school, this very building you stand in, was funded by the Miller Foundation. My money built the science lab. It's my name on the history program you oversee." Miss Whitmore's eyes flicker for just a moment, her proud expression faltering as the weight of his words lands. Her lips tremble, but she doesn't dare speak. "Not yet." James Miller continues, his tone growing colder, more resolute. "Yet despite all of that, you had the audacity to humiliate my grandson, your student, because of his background." The silence that follows is deafening. The students stand frozen, watching the scene unfold in front of them. Some are still, processing the fact that Jacob Miller, the quiet kid from the farm, is this kid, the one who just brought his multi-millionaire grandfather to school. Others are grappling with the realization that Miss Whitmore, once their untouchable teacher, has just been confronted by the very person who funds the institution she so proudly oversees. Miss Whitmore's face goes pale as she stammers, trying to recover from the crushing blow. "Mr. Miller, I didn't mean to..." But James Miller cuts her off, his voice sharp like a whip. "No," he says, his words slow and deliberate. "You didn't mean to, but you did. And I've made it my life's work to ensure that people understand that respect is something earned. It's not given based on titles or bank accounts." He pauses, his piercing eyes never leaving hers. "And you, Ms. Whitmore, have just lost mine." The teacher looks like she's been struck, the color draining from her face as the room watches in stunned silence. This isn't just a simple reprimand. This isn't a typical schoolyard confrontation. This is the kind of moment that changes everything. The students are no longer just passive observers. They are witnessing a real shift in power, one that changes their entire understanding of what's possible. Jacob, once the quiet, shy farm boy, now stands tall behind his grandfather, no longer the butt of jokes or the target of ridicule. His shoulders are squared, and for the first time, he feels the weight of the respect he's always deserved but never received. James Miller turns to his grandson, giving him a small, approving nod. "Jacob," he says, his voice calm but full of pride. "Respect is something you earn through your actions, and today you've earned mine." Jacob feels the weight of the words settle on him. His heart is pounding, but it's not fear or anger anymore. It's something else, something that makes him stand taller, something that makes him proud. Miss Whitmore, now defeated, stands in silence, her eyes downcast, unable to meet anyone's gaze. "I've raised Jacob to know the value of hard work and integrity," James Miller adds, his gaze sweeping across the students who are still watching in awe. "Maybe you should take notes on that, Ms. Whitmore, instead of looking down on those who do the hard work that keeps this country running." The finality of his words lingers in the air as the tension breaks like a dam cracking open. Miss Whitmore can't say another word. She knows she's been exposed. Her once ironclad control is gone, shattered by the very man whose money has kept her employed for years. Jacob takes one final glance at his teacher, no longer fearful, no longer ashamed. With a quiet nod to his grandfather, he turns and walks away, the students parting like the Red Sea as he passes by. He doesn't need their approval. Not anymore. James Miller watches his grandson walk off, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. This moment was all about earning respect. And in front of the entire school, Jacob had done just that. As the helicopter takes off and fades into the distance, the students are left with a new understanding. Jacob Miller wasn't just a farm boy. He was someone who deserved to be heard, someone who had earned his place in this world. And Miss Whitmore, she'd learned a lesson she'd never forget. Never underestimate the power of those you look down on. You might just find that they are the ones holding the real power all along. It's the moment everyone's been waiting for. The wealthy businessman James Miller has just publicly humiliated the teacher who bullied his grandson Jacob. The students are in shock, their eyes glued to the scene unfolding before them. Miss Whitmore, the teacher who thought she could control everything, has nowhere to hide. Her world is about to come crashing down, and it's not going to be pretty. But it's not over yet. The question everyone's asking now is, will she admit her mistake? Will she apologize for everything she's done? Or will she double down on her cruelty and lose everything? The tension in the air is thick, almost suffocating. After James Miller's confrontation with Miss Whitmore, the school feels like it's holding its breath. For the first time, Jacob Miller, quiet, humble, and often the target of ridicule, feels something different. Control. Jacob, standing behind. His grandfather has just witnessed the power shift. But what comes next? What will happen when the teacher realizes the depth of her mistakes, the consequences of her actions? Miss Whitmore is standing there, her face pale and trembling, her gaze locked on the ground. The students are silent. Every person in the room, even the teachers, is waiting for what will come next. They know something must change, and it's all riding on her. Miss Whitmore had always seen herself as untouchable. She was the teacher who controlled the room, the one who commanded respect, and never hesitated to remind the students of their place. But now the tables had turned. The man who funded the school, the one who had the power to pull the strings and change everything with a single phone call, was standing right in front of her. And in that moment, she realized how deeply she had underestimated not just Jacob, but everyone. James Miller's words had echoed in the silence, reverberating through every corner of the room. His presence, his authority, his quiet but unwavering strength had shattered her, and in that silence something shifted inside her. For the first time, she saw herself, really saw herself, through the eyes of those she had belittled, those she had judged too harshly. Jacob steps forward, his posture steady, his face calm. His eyes don't waver. He's been through too much to let the judgment of others define him anymore. And in this moment, as he faces the woman who had humiliated him, he stands tall. But it's not anger in his eyes. No, it's something stronger, dignity. He doesn't need to prove himself anymore. He knows who he is. But then, unexpectedly, Miss Whitmore takes a step forward, her voice shaky but sincere. I am so sorry. Jacob, she says, her words barely audible at first. Her hands are trembling and her eyes are wide, filled with guilt. She swallows hard, as if the weight of her own actions has finally hit her hard. I was wrong to treat you that way. I allowed my pride and arrogance to blind me. The words hang in the air, strange and unfamiliar. Miss Whitmore, the teacher who had been so quick to mock and belittle Jacob, is now apologizing. She is, for the first time, truly vulnerable. The students watch in stunned silence. Some of them exchange glances, unsure of how to process what's happening. The air is thick with tension, but this time it's different. It's not the kind of tension that makes you afraid. It's the kind that makes you hopeful. James Miller, who had been standing in the background watching the scene unfold, steps forward. His presence alone seems to demand respect, and every I in the room follows his every move. He doesn't speak out of anger. Instead, his voice is calm, almost fatherly. He addresses the entire class, the students and teachers alike. Respect is earned, he says, his voice resonating with authority. And it's earned through actions, not wealth. It's earned through integrity, hard work, and the way we treat others, especially those who have less than we do. His gaze turns to Miss Whitmore, who's still standing there, her face red with shame. You may have thought your position gave you power over Jacob, but true power, true respect, comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. He pauses, allowing his words to sink in. Jacob doesn't need anyone's pity. James continues, he doesn't need special treatment. He just wants to be treated with the same respect as anyone else. And that, Ms. Whitmore, is something you should have realized long ago. Jacob's eyes flicker with a quiet pride as he listens to his grandfather's words. James is not just standing up for him. He's standing up for everyone who's ever been judged, belittled, or ignored because of where they came from. And now Jacob speaks. His voice is calm, but there's an undeniable strength in it. I don't want any special treatment, he says, his words clear and firm. I just want respect. The same respect you give to everyone else. I'm not here for favors. I'm not here because of my grandfather's money. I'm here because I deserve to be here, just like anyone else. His words hit harder than anything Miss Whitmore could have ever said. He's not just standing up for himself. He's standing up for every student who's ever felt like an outsider, like they didn't belong, like they weren't good enough. He's telling the room that respect isn't something you give based on status or wealth. It's something you earn through your actions and your character. The silence in the room is deafening. No one moves. No one speaks. All they can do is watch as Jacob, the quiet, humble farm boy, proves that he's more than just what others thought he was. He's a person with dignity, with strength, and most importantly, with the courage to demand respect. Miss Whitmore, still overwhelmed by the weight of her actions, looks up at Jacob. For the first time, her eyes are not filled with judgment or disdain. They are filled with something else, remorse. She steps closer to him, her voice shaky. I'm sorry, Jacob. I see now. I was wrong. You do deserve respect, and I will make sure no one ever treats you like that again. Jacob looks at her for a long moment. Then, without hesitation, he nods. It's not a nod of acceptance or forgiveness. It's a nod of understanding. You don't have to apologize, Jacob says, his voice steady. Just treat me like you treat everyone else from now on. The tension in the room begins to fade, and the students begin to shift. The unease that had once defined their school day, now replaced by a sense of resolution. Jacob's dignity has been upheld. Miss Whitmore has learned her lesson, and the students, many of whom once ridiculed Jacob, are beginning to see him for who he truly is, a person of integrity, of strength, and of worth. As the bell rings, signaling the end of the day, Jacob walks out of the classroom, his head held high. He doesn't need anyone's approval. He's already proven everything he needs to prove, and the world, in that one moment, has been changed forever. As Jacob walks out of the classroom, the weight of the moment begins to settle in. The laughter and whispers that once followed him, the mockery he had endured for so long, it's all gone. In its place, something far more powerful. Respect. The students, once indifferent or even cruel, now look at Jacob with admiration. Some even stand and clap, acknowledging the courage it took for him to stand up, not just for himself, but for everyone who's ever been overlooked or underestimated. It's a moment of transformation. The power dynamics have shifted, and it's clear that Jacob Miller has earned his place. He doesn't need validation from anyone. His dignity has been restored, not by money or status, but by the strength of his character and the integrity of his actions. Behind him, Miss Whitmore stands, A woman who once held power over him, now humbled. The arrogance she once carried has been replaced by humility. She understands, perhaps for the first time in her life, what true respect looks like. And as the students cheer for Jacob, she knows one thing for sure: she will never underestimate another student again. Today, Jacob Miller proved something important. He proved that respect isn't about wealth, status, or where you come from. It's about who you are, what you stand for, and the strength of your character. In the end, integrity and hard work will always speak louder than any title or bank account. So take a moment and reflect on this. What do you stand for? Are you the one who looks down on others, or do you lift them up? Do you value integrity, or is it all about what's on the surface? If you believe respect is earned, not given, if you think integrity should always come before social status, comment "respect first" below and share your thoughts. Let's keep the conversation going, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories that will inspire you to stand tall, live with integrity, and never back down. Because in the end, it's not about how much you have, but how much respect you've earned through your actions.